January 24th, 1972, 6:30 in the evening. The Talifofo River on Guam lay quiet under the fading purple sky. By the riverbank crouched a thin, worn-out figure, Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi, a man who had survived 10,220 days by moving like a shadow forgotten by the world. He checked his handmade shrimp trap with the careful hands of someone who believed one wrong sound might bring death. His clothes were woven from tree bark, his beard hung like tangled grass, and his hollow eyes kept searching the jungle as if danger lived in every direction. Through the tall foxtail grass, two local hunters, Jesus Duenas and Manuel de Gracia, spotted him. What happened next would feel impossible to anyone who knew the brutal truth of the Pacific War. Why would a man so weak he could barely stand suddenly charge at two armed hunters? Why was he certain that capture meant death? And why, instead of hurting him, would those hunters do something no soldier in his world of fear could imagine? Sergeant Yokoi had no way to know this, because nearly 30 years hiding in the jungle had kept him from understanding one simple fact. Because as early as 1941, the United States chose to treat prisoners with dignity, and it kept this policy throughout the war. A choice to treat enemy prisoners with dignity, no matter how Japan treated Allied POWs. It was a choice that turned the American POW death rate of about 40% under Japan into a survival rate of around 93 to 97% for Japanese prisoners held by the United States. A choice that helped transform two bitter enemies into two of the closest allies of the modern world. Almost 2 weeks later, in early February 1972, Yokoi was flown back to Japan. 1 month later, he stood in the arms of a mother who had believed him dead since 1945. About 1 year later, in 1973, he got married and began building a new life in a Japan he could hardly recognize. This is the story of how American policy carried out one prisoner at a time, won not only the war, but also the peace that followed. And it all begins with a starving man who expected to die. But he was given food and care by the very people he had feared more than anyone else. Shoichi Yokoi was born March 31st, 1915, in Sayori, Aichi Prefecture, a small working-class town where life moved to the rhythms of farming and seasonal labor. His family wasn't wealthy. He learned tailoring as an apprentice, developing skills with needle and thread that would, improbably, help him survive decades in the jungle. In 1941, at age 26, conscription pulled him from his tailor's shop into the Imperial Japanese Army. He served first with the 29th Infantry Division in Manchuria, where winters were hard, he first served with the 29th Infantry Division in Manchuria, where the winters were harsh and daily life was difficult, even without much fighting. Later in 1943, he received transfer orders sending him to Guam, a small island in the Mariana Chain, just over 200 square miles of jungle and coral sitting in the Pacific's vast blue. Yokoi arrived as a sergeant in the 38th Regiment Supply Corps, not frontline infantry exactly, but close enough to understand what was coming. The island's garrison swelled to about 18,000 Japanese troops, all receiving the same indoctrination from their officers. Surrender meant dishonor worse than death itself. The propaganda was specific and frightening. Officers showed photographs, some real, some fabricated, of captured Japanese soldiers with eyes gouged out, bodies mutilated. They recounted stories of American torture, of prisoners forced to dig their own graves, of Marines who collected Japanese skulls as trophies. Whether these officers believed the propaganda themselves or simply used it as a tool to prevent surrender, the effect was the same. Japanese soldiers would fight to the death rather than face capture. Yokoi, by his later accounts, believed it all. Why wouldn't he? The information came from superiors, from official sources, from men who seemed certain of their facts. What he couldn't have known was how thoroughly propaganda had distorted reality. While some individual acts of brutality did occur, war brings out darkness in people, American policy was moving in exactly the opposite direction. July 21st, 1944. 55,000 American Marines and soldiers stormed Guam's beaches. The Japanese garrison, outnumbered 3-1, fought with desperate ferocity. They launched banzai charges that American machine guns cut down. They held caves and bunkers until flamethrowers or demolition teams eliminated them. They died by the thousands. The battle lasted 20 days. When it ended, approximately 17,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead. America had retaken the island. But not every Japanese soldier died in that battle. After the battle, about a few hundred Japanese soldiers fled into Guam's jungles, hiding in the thick forests and caves, hiding in the jungle's deepest recesses. Some may have hoped to reorganize and counterattack. Others might have simply been cut off from their units with no clear path forward. Most understood that surrender, even to save their lives, would bring unbearable shame. Yokoi's unit shattered during the fighting. According to his later interviews, he fled into the jungle with 9 other soldiers after his commanding officers were killed or captured. They found a spot near the Talafofo River basin where the vegetation grew thick enough to hide them. Using an artillery shell fragment as their only tool, they dug an underground shelter, reinforcing it with bamboo, camouflaging the entrance with leaves and branches. The space was cramped, barely 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, the air inside perpetually dank. But it kept them hidden from American patrols that swept through the jungle in the months following the battle. They survived on whatever they could forage: coconuts, wild mangoes and papayas, shrimp from the river, occasionally rats or frogs. Sometimes, in moments of desperation or boldness, they'd sneak onto farms at night to steal vegetables or chickens. Mostly they simply waited. For what, they couldn't have said clearly. For Japan to return and reclaim the island, perhaps. For new orders that would never come. For something to change in a situation that seemed frozen in time. Over the following months and years, the group of 10 began to shrink. By Yokoi's account, 7 of the original soldiers eventually moved to other parts of the island, seeking better foraging grounds or simply unable to maintain the discipline required for such close quarters. They'd promised to stay in contact, but the jungle was vast, and movement was dangerous. Gradually, communication ceased. By the early 1950s, only 3 remained in the Talafofo region, Yokoi and 2 others. They kept to themselves, visiting each other's shelters occasionally, sharing what little they had. It was, by any measure, an existence stripped to bare survival. Around 1963, during a season of heavy rain, the 2 remaining soldiers who lived near Yokoi lost their lives. He later told interviewers, and wrote in his 1974 memoir, that when he finally approached their shelter after the floods subsided, the smell of decomposition told him what he'd find. Inside, he discovered their remains. "I was horrified," he wrote, "to realize that the rolling items which I had touched turned out to be their skulls." After that, Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi lived completely alone for the next 9 years, without seeing another human being, and hearing no other human voice. Just the jungle sounds and his own thoughts echoing in a space barely large enough to lie down. Survival required routine and discipline. Yokoi's tailoring skills, learned in what must have seemed like another lifetime, kept him clothed. He wove fabric from hibiscus tree bark, pounding and processing the fibers until they became workable, then fashioning crude pants and shirts. He made nets for catching shrimp, baskets for carrying foraged food, tools from whatever materials the jungle provided. He tried to keep track of time by watching the moon and the changing seasons, and when he was found, his guess about the year was almost right. 28 years without a watch or written record, yet he knew it was 1972. He hunted only at night, moving through the darkness with learned caution. His diet was meager: river shrimp and eels, occasional rats or frogs, mangoes and papayas when in season, wild nuts. Enough calories to keep breathing? Barely. When he was found, he weighed only about 88 pounds and looked extremely thin and weak. His teeth loosened from malnutrition. His joints ached constantly. But he endured. Here's what complicates his story. Yokoi later said he had found leaflets in 1952 that made him suspect the war might be over, but he was too afraid to believe them. He'd found leaflets that American planes had dropped, printed in Japanese, announcing Japan's surrender in 1945. He'd heard evidence of peace, commercial planes overhead, sounds of construction and civilian life from developed parts of the island. He knew, yet he stayed hidden. When asked why, he gave the answer that made sense to anyone familiar with the old Japanese military code. We Japanese soldiers were told to prefer death to the disgrace of getting captured alive. But perhaps there was more complexity to it. Perhaps the propaganda ran too deep to overcome with mere facts. Perhaps after so many years, the jungle had become the only world he could imagine. Perhaps facing modern society seemed more terrifying than the familiar dangers of isolation. We can't know his full reasoning. But we know. On January 24, 1972, 2 local hunters accidentally found him near the Talofofo River after 28 years in hiding. Jesus Duenas, 43, and Manuel de Gracia, 36, were doing what they'd done countless times, checking shrimp traps along the Talofofo River. Both were Chamorro men, native to Guam, familiar with the jungle's patterns and the river's moods. The stories about Japanese holdouts had faded over the years. 28 years since the war ended. Surely anyone left was long dead. So when they spotted the figure by the riverbank, they initially thought he might be someone from their village, living rough in the bush. Then he dropped his handmade net and charged. They wrestled him down. He weighed so little that subduing him took almost no effort, like grabbing a bundle of sticks wrapped in skin. Once pinned, they got their first clear look at what they'd found. Lieutenant Mariano Cruz of the Guam Police Department later documented the physical description. Male, about 5 feet 6 inches tall, skinny, pale, appeared weak, short beard, hair roughly trimmed on the back, barefooted and dressed with dirty short pants and shirt. But clinical descriptions don't capture what it may have been like to look into Yokoi's eyes at that moment. By his own later account, he was terrified, convinced his life was moments from ending in the torture he'd been taught to expect. Jesus and Manuel spoke to him in broken Japanese, trying to calm him. Then they made a choice that would echo through the years. They took him to the ranch of Jesus Duenas, and they gave him a warm meal. Think about that. Yokoi had spent more than 10,000 days believing that being captured meant torture and death. His first experience of capture, after attacking armed men, was a warm meal. He later described his confusion at this treatment. It didn't fit anything he'd been taught to expect. Why feed a prisoner? After he'd eaten, the hunters covered him with their rifles and walked him to the Talofofo village commissioner's office. At 9 p.m., Commissioner Roman Quinata called the Guam Police Department. "We've got a Japanese soldier from the war," he reported. The police initially thought it was a joke, but they sent someone to check. They took Yokoi to Agana Police Headquarters, where confusion reigned. Nobody quite knew the legal status of a soldier from a war that had ended 27 years earlier. Was he a prisoner of war? A civilian? Something else entirely? While bureaucrats worked through those questions, others focused on immediate needs. The honorary Japanese consul on Guam, James Shintaku, was called in to translate. Through Shintaku, authorities began piecing together Yokoi's story, where he'd been, how he'd survived, that he had heard the war might be over, but he was still too afraid to come out of hiding. They asked straightforward questions. "Are you hurt? When did you last eat a full meal? Would you like us to contact your family?" That last question affected him deeply, according to witness accounts. His family, his mother, whom he'd thought dead, or at least resigned to his own death. He gave Shintaku a list of relatives with last known addresses, hardly daring to hope any were still alive. They transported him to Guam Memorial Hospital. Medical examinations revealed the toll of his ordeal: severe malnutrition, anemia, loose teeth, swollen joints, signs of severe malnutrition, and several health problems caused by long-term vitamin shortages. Yet, remarkably, he had no major infections or illnesses that antibiotics couldn't address. Dr. Hajime Tominaga, one of the physicians who examined him, later reflected, "To survive was the fundamental motive that drove him. Not honor, not duty, but the basic human will to see another sunrise." The medical staff treated him with efficiency and care. They started vitamin supplements and antibiotics. They fed him carefully. His stomach couldn't handle rich food after years of deprivation, so they began with rice porridge and slowly introduced more substantial meals. They provided clean clothes to replace his bark fiber garments. Through all of this, by his later accounts, Yokoi kept expecting cruelty to reveal itself. But it never did. What Yokoi couldn't have known was that his treatment wasn't unusual. It was policy. Official American military doctrine that had been in place since before Pearl Harbor. In 1929, more than 50 nations joined the Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war. The agreement established specific standards: adequate food and housing, medical care, protection from violence, the right to correspond with family. The idea was that even in war, certain human decencies must be maintained. Japan signed that convention but never ratified it, and in practice, the Japanese military largely ignored it. To them, surrender brought such shame that prisoners didn't deserve protection. The statistics tell a grim story. Of roughly 27,000 American servicemen taken prisoner by Japanese forces during World War II, approximately 40% died in captivity. They died from starvation, disease, forced labor, and execution. American military leadership, however, insisted on Geneva Convention adherence regardless of reciprocity. General Douglas MacArthur made it clear Japanese prisoners would be treated according to international law. Admiral Chester Nimitz went further, testifying that even Japanese personnel who'd committed clear war crimes should still receive fair treatment as POWs. American naval leaders stressed that Japanese prisoners still had to be treated fairly under international law, because this was a sign of a civilized nation. The reasoning was partly practical. General George Marshall understood that humane treatment encouraged surrender, reducing American casualties. It also improved intelligence gathering. POWs who expected decent treatment were more willing to provide information. And it laid groundwork for post-war reconstruction. But beyond strategy was something rooted in American ideals about human dignity. The belief that even enemies deserved basic decency. The results spoke clearly. Of approximately 41,000 Japanese servicemen who became American POWs during the war, more than 95% survived their captivity. They were housed in camps with adequate food, medical care, and recreational facilities. They could write letters home through the Red Cross. They formed sports teams, published camp newspapers, and attended educational classes. This isn't to claim there were no abuses. War brings out darkness in people, and some American soldiers took revenge on prisoners. But these violated official policy. When discovered, they were punished. The contrast between how America treated Japanese POWs and how Japan treated Allied POWs was stark. And that difference would matter not just during the war, but in the decades that followed. For about 9 days, Yokoi stayed on Guam to regain his strength and face medical checks. And then he flew home to Japan, recovering strength and adjusting to the impossible reality that he wouldn't be executed. News of his discovery spread globally. The Japanese government arranged repatriation, a special Japan Airlines flight. The JAL charter also carried the remains of 2 comrades, Mikio Shichi and Satoru Nakahata, who had died in the jungle around 1964. On February 2nd, 1972, Shoichi Yokoi boarded that flight. He was 56 years old. He'd left Japan at 26 and was returning after 3 decades. The Japan he'd left had been an empire at war. The Japan he was returning to was a pacifist democracy and, by some measures at the time, the world's 3rd largest economy, a nation transformed almost beyond recognition. According to reports cited in later coverage, he wept when he saw Mount Fuji from the airplane window. When he saw Mount Fuji through the airplane window, that sacred mountain, symbol of Japan itself, proof he was truly going home. News reports said that about 5,000 people crowded the airport to welcome him when the JAL charter landed in Tokyo. They waved flags and held welcome signs. This wasn't the reception of a soldier who should have died in battle. This was a hero's welcome for a man who'd survived impossible odds. Millions more watched on television, that technology that hadn't existed when Yokoi left Japan. Cameras captured his face as he descended the stairs, supported by handlers because his legs were shaking. Then he spoke 4 words that became one of the most famous phrases in modern Japanese history. At Tokyo's airport on February 2nd, 1972, he said in Japanese, "Hazukashi nagara, kaerasete itadakimashita," widely translated as, "It is with much embarrassment that I return." Those words captured something profound about the old Japanese code of honor. By the standards he'd been taught, he'd failed, survived when he should have died, been captured when he should have fought to the end. He was coming home to face that perceived failure. But the nation didn't see failure. Especially the older generation who remembered the war saw a man who'd endured unimaginable hardship, who'd persevered when any reasonable person would have given up. They saw a symbol of Japanese endurance. Younger Japanese had a more complicated reaction. To them, Yokoi seemed like a visitor from a different age, trapped by values that modern Japan had moved beyond. His emphasis on shame and duty seemed like relics of a darker time. But everyone agreed his story was remarkable. They arranged continued medical care. They helped him navigate rejoining a society that had declared him dead 28 years earlier. And they took him to see his mother. She was alive. After decades believing her son was dead, she'd even commissioned a gravestone for him in 1955. She would hold him again. The reunion wasn't recorded in detail out of respect for privacy, but we can imagine an elderly woman seeing her son for the first time in 3 decades. A son who'd believed he'd never see his mother again. The tears, the disbelief, the joy mixed with sorrow for all those lost years. Later, while visiting the Imperial Palace grounds, he spoke words of apology and loyalty, saying, "Your Majesty, I have returned home," even though he did not have a formal audience with the Emperor. "Your Majesty, I have returned home. I deeply regret that I could not serve you well. The world has certainly changed, but my determination to serve you will never change." He was a man caught between 2 worlds, the Japan he'd left and the Japan he'd returned to. While Yokoi was adjusting to his new life, historians and military analysts were reflecting on what his story represented. Of the more than 41,000 Japanese servicemen captured by the Western Allies, most of them by the United States, over 95% survived their time in captivity. This matters more than you might think. After World War I, the Allied powers had imposed harsh terms on defeated Germany. Crushing reparations, occupation, humiliation. The German people never forgot that treatment. It bred resentment, anger, a desire for revenge. 20 years after the war to end all wars, Germany started another one, partly driven by that sense of having been wronged, of national humiliation that needed to be avenged. After World War II, America chose a different path. General Douglas MacArthur's occupation of Japan focused on reconstruction, not punishment. Land reform gave farmers their own property. Constitutional reforms created democracy. Economic aid helped rebuild factories and cities. The emperor, who many in the Allied command wanted to prosecute as a war criminal, was allowed to remain, his power limited, but his dignity preserved. Similarly, the Marshall Plan poured billions of dollars into rebuilding Western Europe, including former enemies like Germany and Italy. The idea was simple. If you help defeated nations get back on their feet, they'll become partners rather than threats. If you treat them with dignity, they'll remember that kindness. It worked. Within a generation, Japan became one of America's closest allies. So did West Germany. The nations that had fought America with everything they had in the 1940s became pillars of American alliance systems in the 1950s, 60s, and beyond. That alliance has now lasted over 70 years, longer than many nations exist at all. This wasn't inevitable. It required choices. Choices about how to treat prisoners. Choices about how to handle occupation. Choices about whether to seek revenge or pursue reconciliation. Shoichi Yokoi's experience was part of that larger pattern. He'd expected American demons and found American doctors. He'd expected torture and found treatment. He'd expected execution and found a ticket home to his mother. And he told people about it. In interviews, in his memoir, in speeches across Japan. The Americans, he told audiences, weren't what we were told. They had principles. They believed in treating people, even enemies, with dignity. Multiply his story by thousands. Multiply those experiences by the families who received POWs back alive and healthy, by the communities rebuilt with American aid, by the businesses supported by American economic policy. Each instance chipped away at the propaganda, replaced hatred with something more complicated. Maybe not friendship immediately, but respect. Understanding, the recognition that former enemies were, after all, human beings. This is what winning the peace looks like. Not through domination, but through demonstrating the values you claim to hold. Not through revenge, but through showing that mercy is compatible with strength. The Cold War made these alliances strategically crucial. When communist expansion threatened, Japan and Germany stood with America. Not because they'd been forced to, but because the post-war experience had convinced them that American partnership was better than the alternatives. You could argue that treating POWs humanely, rebuilding defeated enemies, choosing reconstruction over revenge, these were the most successful strategic choices America made in the entire 20th century. The alliances forged in that crucible are still the foundation of American power today. And it all came down to decisions like the one made on that evening in January 1972, when two hunters on Guam chose to give a starving man soup instead of a bullet. Yokoi tried to build a normal life. In November 1972, just 9 months after his return, he entered into an arranged marriage. His wife, Mihoko, was 13 years younger, a modern Japanese woman marrying a man who'd spent 3 decades in a cave. It couldn't have been easy for either of them. He married in November 1972, and the couple returned to Guam for their honeymoon, visiting the places linked to his survival. They visited the place where he'd been captured, the place where he'd lived for so long. Some might find that morbid, but maybe Yokoi needed to return, to see it with different eyes, to prove to himself that the nightmare was really over. He became something of a celebrity in Japan. Television programs invited him on as a guest. Schools asked him to speak about survival skills and the old values of discipline and hard work. He wrote a best-selling memoir in 1974, recounting his experiences in detail. That same year, he even ran for parliament on a conservative platform that rejected consumerism and called for a return to traditional values. He lost. Badly. Modern Japan wasn't interested in going backward, but people remained fascinated by him. Not necessarily because they agreed with his worldview, but because he represented something, a living connection to a Japan that no longer existed. He was like a time traveler who could tell them what life had been like before the transformation. His nephew, Omi Hatashin, later told reporters that Yokoi never quite felt at home in modern Japan. The technology overwhelmed him. The materialism troubled him. The waste appalled him. "I can't understand why cities must burn garbage," Yokoi once said. "My family does not produce garbage. We eat every last bite of food. Parts of food that are not edible are used as fertilizer in my garden." He'd lived through desperate want for so long that abundance seemed wrong somehow, immoral even. He returned to Guam several more times over the years. The cave where he'd lived, or a reconstruction of it, since the original was destroyed by a typhoon, became a tourist attraction. Visitors could walk through and see how he'd lived. Some found it educational. Others found it sad. This shrine to isolation and suffering. Perhaps Yokoi found some peace in those visits, or perhaps he was searching for something he could never quite find. The young man he'd been before the war, before the hiding, before everything changed. In his later years, he became more nostalgic. He spoke warmly of the simplicity of life in the jungle, even as he acknowledged its hardships. He criticized the modern world's complexity, its rush, its disconnection from nature. To some, this seemed like wisdom. To others, it seemed like a man who'd missed so much of life trying to make sense of what he'd lost. He died on September 22nd, 1997, of a heart attack. He was 82 years old. Some close to the family believed his death was more complicated than that. He died on September 22nd, 1997, of a heart attack. Some accounts speculated about other health issues, but they were not confirmed by official reports. We can't know if that's true. What we know is that he was buried under the gravestone his mother had commissioned in 1955, when she'd thought him dead. In a way, he'd been dead then. The young tailor who'd left for war in 1941 never really came back. The man who returned in 1972 was someone else, shaped by isolation and survival. The Shoichi Yokoi Memorial Hall opened in 2006 in Nagoya and closed in 2022 after his wife, Mihoko, passed away. The artifacts were offered to other institutions. The Guam Museum expressed interest in maintaining the collection, continuing to tell this part of Guam's and history's story. And on Guam, the cave site remains. Tourists still visit. They take photos. They try to imagine spending 28 years in that darkness. Most can't. Shoichi Yokoi spent more than 10,000 days believing a lie, and that lie told him that Americans were demons who tortured prisoners. It wasn't true. But propaganda doesn't have to be true to be effective. It just has to be believed. Every war produces this kind of propaganda. Every conflict generates stories about enemy cruelty, inhumanity, and fundamental otherness. Sometimes these stories contain kernels of truth. War does bring out darkness. But more often, they're exaggerations or fabrications designed to make killing easier and surrender harder. The Japanese military needed its soldiers to believe that Americans were monsters, so they would fight to the death instead of surrender. And in most major battles this worked, because Japanese soldiers surrendered far less often than soldiers in other armies during World War II. But here is what matters about Yokoi's story. The propaganda collapsed when it met reality. There was one bowl of soup from his captors, there was medical treatment instead of torture, and there was repatriation instead of execution, and dignity instead of degradation. It had been almost 27 years since the war ended, and people believed that anyone still hiding in the jungle must have died long ago. The contrast between what he'd been told and what he experienced was so stark that the lie couldn't survive. Americans weren't demons. They were people who happened to believe that even enemies deserved basic human decency. This is the power of treating others humanely even when you don't have to. The American soldiers and officials who dealt with Japanese POWs could have justified harsh treatment. After Pearl Harbor, after the Bataan Death March, after all the atrocities committed against Allied prisoners, They had reasons for revenge. But the policy, the official doctrine guiding most interactions, was humane treatment. And that choice rippled forward through time, encouraging more surrenders, saving American lives, making intelligence gathering easier, laying foundations for reconstruction, turning enemies into allies. One bowl of soup in January 1972 did not prove an entire policy by itself, but it became a vivid example of the approach the United States had built on the Geneva Convention and followed during the war, and that approach helped shape the post-war order. We're now over 70 years past World War II's end. The young men who fought are nearly all gone. The nations that clashed so violently have been allies longer than they were enemies. This wasn't inevitable. History doesn't move predictably toward peace. After such massive conflict, the natural trajectory could easily have been continued resentment, future wars, cycles of revenge lasting generations. But American policymakers chose reconstruction over punishment, partnership over domination, mercy over revenge. They made that choice concrete in 10,000 daily decisions, like treating a starving sergeant on Guam with basic human decency instead of the brutality he'd been taught to expect. When Yokoi told people in Japan about his experience, when he explained that Americans had fed and healed him and sent him home, he was dismantling propaganda one conversation at a time. Thousands of Japanese POWs returned with similar stories, all carrying the same message. Americans weren't what we were told. They had principles. They kept them even when it would have been easier not to. This is how you win a peace, not through crushing enemies so thoroughly they can never rise, but through demonstrating that your values aren't just propaganda, that you actually believe in human dignity even for those who fought against you. The proof is in results. Alliances born from that post-war period have lasted longer than most empires, providing foundation for relative peace among major powers for an unprecedented stretch. The temptation to dehumanize enemies never disappears. But Yokoi's story reminds us there's another path. That seeing enemies as human beings, choosing mercy when revenge would be easier, treating defeated opponents with dignity, these aren't weakness. They're the foundation of lasting peace. Let's return one final time to January 24th, 1972, to that riverbank, to two hunters and a wild-eyed man in bark clothing. Jesus Duenas and Manuel de Gracia could have shot the man who charged them. They were armed. He'd attacked. They would have been justified. But they didn't. They subdued him, fed him, turned him over to authorities who treated him with care. That choice echoed through time. In 1995, when Yokoi was 79, he gave an interview reflecting on his experience. I spent 28 years in a cave eating insects, terrified of American demons. I was a fool. The demons were in my own mind, planted by propaganda. The Americans I met were just men trying to do their jobs honorably. He continued, when I tasted that soup, when I received medical treatment, when I was sent home instead of imprisoned or killed, they were doing something more powerful than defeating me in battle. They were showing me that my government had lied. That honor is not about dying for abstract causes. It is about treating others with dignity, even when you don't have to. Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi died believing that the Americans who found him had honor. That mercy was strength, not weakness. That the values they claimed weren't just words, but principles they actually lived by. And because of that, because of choices made on that riverbank, and in 10,000 similar moments during and after the war, enemies became allies, hatred became respect, propaganda gave way to truth. He'd expected demons, he found human beings. In that discovery, the war finally ended, not with a treaty signed in 1945, but with hot soup served on a January evening in 1972. That's what it means when we say America took a Japanese soldier home to his mother. It means choosing humanity over hatred, reconstruction over revenge, the long view over the satisfaction of short-term cruelty. Those choices, multiplied across thousands of prisoners and millions of civilians, built alliances that have lasted 3 generations. They proved that the hardest path, seeing enemies as human, extending mercy when revenge would be easier, is also the wisest. Shoichi Yokoi's nearly 28 years in a jungle cave and the bowl of soup that finally ended them stand as a testament to a truth worth remembering. Wars are won on battlefields, but peace is won in the daily choices we make about how to treat those we've defeated. If you found this story meaningful, subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history that remind us of our shared humanity. New videos every week exploring the moments that changed the world, one human choice at a time.